Okay, so this is the Atlas Project. I'm Greg Salmieri. We had episode 26 on Tuesday. I was supposed to do it from, I had said Boston, actually, Cambridge, but there was a storm that prevented that. So we did episode 26 on part 3, chapter 6 from down in New Jersey, with Ben joining us as usual via electronic connection from New Orleans. But now my Cambridge-Boston plans have resumed. I'm back up here, and we are happy to be with a Boston area group in Cambridge to have a supplemental broadcast discussing the novel. So here we are, gathered. Should I say where we are, or is there any?
Go ahead.
We're at the Harvard Observatory, or the Smithsonian Harvard. What's the name of it?
Called the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, but
The Harvard
Harvard
Smithsonian
College
Center.
Observatory is the actual location.
So, not rocket science, what we're doing, but we're doing it in a location that's appropriate for it. Or astrophysics, I guess. It's not rocket science. That's
Well, we have some rocket scientists.
You do? Okay. So, since this is a supplemental episode, I don't have a lot of specific topics on mind. One thing we might want to talk a little bit more about that we didn't get to talk about as much in either of the last two episodes is the fate of the wet nurse, Tony, and his development over the course of the book. And so we can talk a little bit about that, but otherwise I'm going to be relying on you guys, both the assembled Bostonians or Greater Charles River area crew, and everyone online. So please do post in with topics, questions, things you guys are interested in talking about, and I'm able to read the comments, I believe. Let's get down to business. So, first thoughts about the wet nurse, Tony. This is the character, recall, that was introduced as the deputy director of distribution who was sent to oversee Reardon's compliance with the Equalization of Opportunity and Fair Share Act, and came to admire Reardon, came to be really on his side, didn't report certain things to the authorities that he could have, and at one point offered to help Reardon bootleg Reardon metal, and we've now seen him meet his end in chapter 6. Some really touching aspects of that scene that we didn't comment on, but that people had commented on in the Facebook discussion. Reardon kisses the boy's forehead as he's dying. He said, "Did you know what you did?" And he said, "Put your head back and I'll do it again." He calls him Tony for the first time, always having called him non-absolute before. The other people at the mills call him the wet nurse. This is a really sad scene. There's definitely, I think, a vibe of him being like Reardon's son. And this is the kissing his forehead and so forth. One interesting just bibliographical note is that the character arcs in this novel were very carefully planned. There are notes and notes on them, who's going to be introduced when and what their progression is, but not this character. This character was sort of written, she threw him in as a kind of one-off line to describe the annoyance of this law and how it was operating. And then as she was writing, she just found the occasion to put him in again and again to concretize different points, and came to just this, the character evolved just as she was writing without her planning it, which is one of the few things like that in this novel that kind of just came out as she went. So that's just an interesting fact about him, an interesting fact about it literarily. It's also interesting that other bibliographical thoughts, and people have asked a lot about where Reardon's family came from and why they don't seem to have blue-collar origins like Reardon does. At an earlier point in the planning, although this was before she even started writing, there was the idea that Reardon was going to be older and Philip then would have been his son, or there would be a character that was Reardon's son, and I'm assuming Philip ended up playing that role. Reardon was then made a younger man when she had the idea that the Reardon-Dagny romance would be part of the plot. And that was before she started actually writing. But that, I wonder if you have traces of the idea of Philip as Reardon's son in that he seems to have come, he acts like he's always come from a wealthy upbringing. It might also be that he's just younger enough than Reardon. Reardon sent him through college. So, I guess when he was very young, they wouldn't have been wealthy, but they would have been at some point. Ben asks if he could have been the surf character. So there's this idea that I just heard recently, I forget who brought it up, maybe David brought it up online, that Bennett Cerf thinks a character was written for him in Atlas Shrugged, and Benny suggesting that that could be Tony the Wet Nurse. That's I tend to think not, but it is possible given the timing. Although no, because Rand started shopping the book around to publishers only after she'd written Galt's speech. She would have written Galt's speech after she wrote the death scene, unless she went back to insert it later. So I think we really need to bring out the big guns to answer that kind of question and ask Shoshana, who knows everything about the drafts. And this is Shoshana Milgram, whose work you can find on this topic in Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, edited by Robert Mayu, who joined us a couple of weeks ago. All right, so that's just some literary background on the Reardons and on Tony. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts or questions or ideas they want to bring up pertaining specifically to Tony? And then if not, we'll broaden out to the Reardons family. Yeah, Matt?
It's interesting to me that this was not a planned character, partially because I think that there are at least two really important ideas this scene in particular dramatizes. So one is that that the distinction between living and non-living is very fundamental, and how does this look for human beings? This guy has been struggling to activate his mind and live in a certain way, and it doesn't work, and the result is that he's just a pile of chemicals in Reardon's hand, and the language is extremely wrenching and dramatic. And that idea is very prominent in Galt's speech and in the book, that it's core to the idea of life is the fundamental, life is the standard of value, and I don't think it's dramatized anywhere more starkly than this. And this is the scene where that idea becomes very real.
Yeah.
And the second is, there might be other characters like this that I'm just not thinking of, but he's a kind of pitiable character. He's a character who's broken and who's governed by bad ideas, but who is not his fault in a certain way. He's kind of at least partially absolved of the language in the scene is, what were his parents thinking? They measured out every spoonful of his formula, but they ruined his mind, and so he's kind of portrayed as a cripple in a certain way, and that idea, it's there in the book, it's throughout the book, but you never really see kind of live through a character, what is it like to be this person, and how will they struggle, and what is it like? Cheryl Taggart is kind of like that, but different. She's more heroic. So I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine the book without this scene. So.
Yeah, the cripple is a bird whose wings were mangled and died his first time trying to fly on them. He is heroic in this last scene, right? Yeah. So he crawls up 200 or 100 feet of slag to do. He takes a larger than life action. I think prior to this last scene, he's admirable but not heroic. Whereas Cheryl, there is months over which she comes across as heroic, as she's looking into and facing, trying to understand what happened to her. But I do think both of those points are striking. There's not another example that I can think of a character who has this kind of self-improvement arc other than the central characters. And there it's self-improvement from a much higher point, right? And that is interesting. And it's, now, she says she wrote him inspirationally or wrote him as she was writing. She says this in the biographical interview. So in 1961 and 1962, she recorded quite a long series of interviews with Barbara and Nathaniel Brandon that were the basis of the biographical essay that Barbara Brandon wrote in the book, Who is Ayn Rand, and were intended for other uses later. And Barbara used them sometimes inaccurately in her later biography of Ayn Rand, and there are copies of them, transcripts of them in the Ayn Rand archives, which I've read. So in there she talks about this fact about the character that she wrote him inspirationally, by which she means she wrote the bits about him scene by scene without a plan going forward. Now, I don't know that that means that by the time she got to this last scene with him, she hadn't really thought it out. She might have noticed where it was going, and she might have had a plan to at some point have an episode illustrating the life-death contrast very starkly and said, oh, well, given the way the wet nurse has evolved, he'll be perfect for it now. But I don't know. I mean, it might have been that that came to her while she was doing that. This whole life versus death point, and that it applies to all living things, and the way human beings are and aren't like other living things, is something she, which we'll talk about more next week in connection with Call to Speech, is something she talks about having gotten a lot clearer on in the pre-writing of Atlas Shrugged than she had been beforehand in The Fountainhead. She called it the values for weeds point. And we'll talk about that, I hope, next week. But it is a very startling illustration, very stark illustration of the difference between life and death and the fundamentality of that difference. Pooja, also, and the other issue is just there's not another kind of redemptive character arc in the story, except insofar as you view Reardon and Dagny that way, and they're not quite that way. So I think it's an important element to the story that we have this. It kind of gives a much wider sense of what kind of transitions and developments human beings are capable of than we would have without it. So Pooja is saying it's not clear what the wet nurse responds to when he starts to admire Reardon and the mill. Is there something good in him from before, maybe? Thoughts? Do people have thoughts on that before I know? Go.
Yeah, I have some thoughts. Certainly, at first, when the wet nurse sees Reardon, nothing that he's learned in school gives him the idea that such a person could be possible, and so he's just in awe. Now, in terms of why is it like an awe in the sort of the positive sense and not sort of just disbelief or rejection of what he's seeing, I think that's a sort of a more difficult question to answer. But when you look at the character characterized as being having nothing but uncertainty about physical objects, and then seeing Reardon in this context of the mill where everything's under his control, I think that would be something that to a more honest mind would be very attractive, and one to try to understand what gives Reardon this power and what kind of person is he, what makes him possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Duron online is making a similar point. He's saying that this character has a fundamental honesty about him, and I think that's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he sees by the way that people react to him around there, the way they react to Reardon as he's going through, he recognizes early on that he's getting in the way. He has to get in the way. He doesn't quite understand why he's in the way of what's going on there, and I think he picks up on that. The idea that I wanted to get back to of where your mind's wings should have grown is something that Rand, I think, brought up repeatedly in nonfiction and speeches and whatever that she wrote afterwards. So if this was an add-on or throw-in or sort of inspirational character that occurred to her at some point, it certainly made an impression on her, because she continued to make, if this is the first reference to mangled wings, that is written in there. And there's no question that she also, extending the point, knows exactly where she wants to lay the blame for. And it really isn't even his parents. This is doggone college professors that are the ones who really messed him up. And that it's hammered home pretty explicitly and heavily in review of Reardon's anger at this
the assassins of classroom. And Reardon, the parents' guilt, insofar as there is in not having taken the kind of care over the child's education that they took over his baby formula and so forth. They should have been looking for men like Hugh Axton, but instead they just sent him to whoever to fill his head with whatever.
I didn't mean to exonerate the parents,
but it is the college professors who are printed as the main culprits. And you mentioned Rand's nonfiction. For people interested in this theme in Rand, the primary essay here is an essay called The Comprachicos, which I think is in The Voice of Reason, is where it's available. I'm not positive that's the anthology it's published in, but I'm pretty sure. But anyway, if you Google it, you'll find a reference to it. It's the Compra Chicos, and that term is from a, I think actually probably fictitious profession described in a Victor Hugo novel of people who mangled children's features so that they could then be in a sideshow when they grew up, or something like that. I'm not sure exactly why they did it. It's in The Man Who Laughs.
And
But is what was
Mountebanks.
But what was their goal in doing this mangling? Was it?
Well, they were. It was a show.
So it was entertainment to be in like a sideshow. Yeah. And it's Ben tells me it's in Return of the Primitive, which is the revised version of the New Left that this is described. And Rand likens them to what goes on in preschools, and at least what she calls progressive preschools, which is the Stadler kind of preschool that was popular at the time and probably still is. So anyway, but there's a lot of similar language there, and then she talks about how that kind of mentality filters up through, or similar things are at work in the whole educational process, and we get discussions that are quite similar to what she says about Tony.
And there's also a reference about school teachers turning out class after class of cowards. And
in the train sequence in Atlas Shrugged, the school teacher. So we have a lot of blame on this profession. So what is the? So several of us are in this profession, but we're trying to be the anecdote, not anecdote, antidotes, rather than anecdotes of this problem. But yeah, so there are a few points. We started out with, so what have we said about Tony so far? So there's this, like, the idea that he had a fundamental honesty to him, that he was harmed or destroyed by his teachers, and that he hadn't met or encountered anyone like Reardon before, and so this encounter was important to him. It's worth keeping in mind, too, that, does anyone remember what his degree is in? Metallurgy, yeah. So he went to college interested in metallurgy, right? Interested, and when he asks Reardon for a job, he says, I have a degree in metallurgy. I know it's not worth anything, but this is the idea. This is what he wanted to do when he started, to be in metal making. And then when he got to college, he was told no actual facts about, melting metal making, so he ends up saying things like, iron making, to me, it seems, involves a high temperature, these very vague and tentative thoughts, and then issues only absolutes and categorical imperatives about men. So he didn't get out of his college what he was looking for when he went into it. He didn't know that or recognize that maybe at the time, but having then found Reardon and had his example, maybe he's starting to see the difference more clearly. I do think there was something good in him from the start. There was something that made him interested in this field. He followed that interest to the extent of becoming a deputy looter in the steel business rather than some other business. And there's also, and we'll have to look in Galt's speech at what he says about the motivations and the nature of the different beliefs that we see that Tony held as they're held by other people. But there are definitely, in Galt's view at least, more and less innocent ways to hold these views. And these views are kind of, in their nature, rationalizations for Jim Taggart-like behavior. But that doesn't mean that everybody who holds them primarily for those reasons. I think Galt thinks that if you're fully innocent, you probably won't come to the place of accepting them or having nothing to say but them in the way Tony does. But you could just be saying them because this is what you're taught and this is what's said, and they don't mean a whole lot to you, and they're not serving the function of rationalizing something you're trying to get away with. Or at least that's not your primary reason why you're believing them. Whereas it does seem to be the primary reason why someone like Jim Taggart or Lillian Reardon believes them, or Simon Pritchett or Floyd Ferris. But this is someone who, this is what he was taught. He's kind of naive. He's looking for knowledge. This is what he's told. Maybe if he were more independent of mind, he wouldn't have believed it or bought it, or he would have thought more deeply about it. But he's not someone who's driven by any kind of hatred for absolutes or for the good or for people like Reardon. He's sort of more described like a savage, and this is a word maybe we should talk about at some point because it has a really bad rap these days. But I take it the meaning of a savage here is not, and he's described as like with the innocence of a savage at one point, is not that savages are so horrible. It's that what's meant is somebody who is uneducated in the ways of society and civilization, right? Which, if you think society and civilization are good, is a bad thing that the person hasn't been educated in them. But it's not his fault. I mean, he's just lacking the acculturation of civilization, doesn't know things that you might assume people would know if you're somebody who grew up in civilization. And that's, I think, the significance of giving him the kind of innocence, describing him as having the innocence of a savage. Ben, if you're going to be here, you could be online and talking to us, and we could have your image. But anyway, Ben's saying just in the text, noble savage. So yeah, Rousseau, right, who thought well of savages, talks about the nobility of a savage, that it's civilization that breeds into you these bad ideas of various sorts, breeds into you, but, acculturates you with these bad ideas. And there's this meaning of savage, which is just a person who's not from civilization. And I think that's the sense in which we have to read it here. Now, Rand doesn't think it's noble because she thinks civilization is good, although there's a lot of bad in it, too, in the way our civilization has gone. Anyway, we'll talk about savagery a little bit in connection in our second session on Galt's speech, I think, because there's a discussion of savages and of the relationship between thinkers and scientists and savages and the role of these ideas in making people savage-like. Hi, Will. I see you finally got online. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so any other thoughts or concerns about Tony? Yeah.
I have a question about Tony. Do you think that his death has a part in Reardon's character arc? Like, is the end of this chapter regarding Reardon's deliverance from the moochers and the looters, is Tony kind of a capstone on that, basically saying, look, you don't leave, people will die?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Ben and I were talking a little bit, both offline and in the session on Tuesday, about when it is that Reardon goes on strike. And in the full sense, it's only in the aftermath of the chapter, right? He doesn't know there is such a thing as the strike. He knows in some sense there are these people who are leaving, but he doesn't know what exactly it is. And then Francisco comes and finds him at the end of the chapter, and we know he's ready to go on strike. But at one level, it seems like he's already on strike. He's already looking at the world as the strikers do when he's driving back from the meeting in New York, and he sees his mills in the distance, and he has just the kind of perspective on them that we see the strikers having. So I think he's sort of ready to go on strike, or kind of psychologically on strike, but just doesn't know, where to sign up from this point on, and that's before he encounters Tony dying. So that's an argument for he's already made this decision, or basically made it. He just needs to be presented with an action step. On the other hand, he's described as waking up in his office, and there's another moment at which it seems like something new has clicked in him, and this is now when he's going to go on strike, which is when he sees his office and he feels the bandage on his head from being hit by the thug, and those two things just don't belong in the same universe, and he sees the face of the thug wielding the club in his memory, and that kind of totally distills what his enemies have been, and now he's ready to go on strike. Now, I think he already was, but in another sense, I don't know, somehow it's made it more concrete to him. We could try to pause over what's changed in the interval. So that would suggest that if he hadn't gone on strike by the time of the Tony incident, it was this last clubbing incident rather than the Tony incident that made him go on strike. So though I think the Tony thing has a role to play in his thinking, I don't think it's that shift that makes him go on strike, especially since he's going on. People are going to die either way. I mean, and arguably, this guy wouldn't have died in this way if not for the strike. That is, the society would have been bad and gone ill, but much more slowly and in much less overt a way. And so probably this kid, it wouldn't have been within one generation that things were breaking out into this kind of violence at steel mills. So I don't think it's concretely people will die unless I do. But go ahead. But it might be it reveals the stakes or something, or reveals that this is real death we're talking with and dealing with in real thuggery. Pooja says the wet nurse starts with feelings first just like Reardon. Your friends would have been delighted to hear it. So he starts with feelings just like Reardon, Pooja, you're saying, not that his feelings are just like Reardon's, but like Reardon, his feelings are ahead of his intellectual understanding on something. So like, and I think that's true of the wet nurse. He has the sense that what the looters are doing is wrong, that Reardon's giving them a moral beating, and that Reardon's good, right, before he understands why and what that means. And Reardon has that too. Okay. So that's Tony. Does people want to talk? I mean, we're now at not at the end of Reardon in the novel, but we're at the end of this development we've been tracing where now Reardon is going on strike. So do people have any further thoughts on Reardon's arc, or on the Reardons? Lillian, the mother, Philip? It sounds like a reality show. That might not be a good reality show. The Reardons. Anyway, any thoughts on this set of themes or topics? Nothing new in the room. Anything online on this? We're getting a laughing face. I don't know if that's because of the Reardon's comment or something else. It's hard to tell. These things come over a second later.
Reality show comment.
Yeah. Will says we noticed that Reardon's two meetings and confrontations are parallel. I think that's right. This is the meeting he has with his family and the meeting he has with the looters. They're in succession. He's realizing things in each of them. In each of them, recollections of things Francisco said to him prior are helping to prompt and give him words to put these realizations in. I think that's right. And after the reference to brother cannibalism, Will says, he tells the looters, "You want to eat me and have me too." I think that's right. You want to have your cake and eat it too, and that they're uncomfortable with, or they're confused by. So he says, "No, me, you want to eat me and have me too."
I just have one little comment on the chapter as such. It's titled "The Concerto of Deliverance," which of course is a reference to the Halley Concerto, but it's also, I think, a reference to the fact that concertos have three movements, and there's basically three big scenes in this chapter. First with the moochers, then with the looters, and then with Tony and Francisco and getting out of there. And I think it kind of, the trinary structure, I think, works.
I hadn't thought of that. We talked a little bit about, on the broadcast last time, Ben had made a good point about how various of the specific themes conveyed in the concerto, when it's described, are in different parts of this chapter. But the structure of it being structured like a concerto is not something I'd thought of, and that's plausible. Also, something you said I want to pick up on, because I don't think we've made this point. You said first with the moochers and then with the looters. So I don't think we've talked that much about this terminology. We've talked about the terminology of looters, but the difference between a looter and a moocher is somebody who wants something for nothing from you, right, and tries to get it by means of begging and tears. And a looter is someone who wants something for nothing from you and tries to take it from you by force. And so Reardon's family, though they are apostles of looting, and Philip's involved in helping some of the looting happen, and Lillian too. Their primary relation to Reardon is as moochers. They're people who are living off him and trying to make him feel guilty or Larkin, Paul Larkin's, Larkin I think, is both a looter and a moocher, since he's involved in the political scheming to tie Reardon at the beginning. But so the moochers are trying to beg from you, and the looters are trying to take from you, until he goes from the people who've been mooching off of him and cutting them off fully, realizing that they don't want to live, to the people who are looting from him, realizing, or taking it for given that they don't want to live. But now the new thing I think he's realizing with them is why it is that they're able to get away with this, and we talked about that. And it's only because he's granting them power, which is easier to see in the case maybe of the moochers than of the looters. And so it's striking that he would catch it there. Let's see. Duron is saying their false remorse helps him to leave. We discussed that a bit. I think that's possible. So we're getting other comments on the parallels. Ben asked if there's anything we could discuss as a prelude to the speech, and I think there's a fair amount. But so I'll say some things in that connection towards the end if they don't come up organically. Do people have any other topics in that are, they want to? Does anyone want to raise anything else that we haven't discussed yet?
Yeah, I don't think, certainly because Reardon's discussion with the looters, the locks that are clicking, or the tumblers that are clicking in his mind, is he's understanding what's really underneath what the looters are doing. We did talk about that last time. But there is something sort of unusual that struck me about the way the looters are approaching it in this chapter, which I don't think necessarily came through all that clearly in the last chapter, is that they have this strategy where they're trying to see some way that they can get Reardon they can make it seem like Reardon has something to gain from dealing with them. And so they sort of take his money, and then they say, well, we can give you back your money. And then they create sort of artificial complaints in the workers, and they say, well, we can use the arbitrary power of the unification board to prevent them from getting what they want. And then the ultimate scheme was that there was going to be a physical attack of taking over his mills, and they were going to come in and restore order. But this is all things that they're sort of introducing that make his life harder, that they're going to say, okay, we'll grant you the favor of taking those things away if you, in exchange, engage in this sacrifice, which is, even though they have it pitched as, well, the steel unification plan is going to be good for the whole industry as a whole. I mean, really, it's pretty clear to see, as as the wet nurse identified, that it's just a plan to skin him alive.
Mm.
It's like, here's a gun in your face. I will take it out of your face if you give me such and such.
Yeah, and this is a scene. I mean, I think we've seen this happening in different ways throughout the book, but we're getting these clearest examples of it with Reardon now, and this is definitely something by prelude to Galt's speech that Galt will talk about this, and we'll see further instances of it after the speech. So that is Reardon's way of dealing with people is trade, offering value for value with them. The looters' way of dealing with people is pseudo-trade, but the value they're purporting to offer is the removal of a threat that they've themselves introduced. And sometimes overtly introduced, and sometimes covertly introduced by engineering a threat that then they can remove. What's going on in the chat? Mohammed's asking if the term brother's keeper, or pointing out that the term brother's keeper applies literally to Hank's relationship to Philip. Brother's keeper was the title of the chapter before last, chapter 5. Not only does it apply literally to Hank's relationship to Philip, but to Dagny's relationship to Jim, right? We have two brothers who are not admirable, to say the least, of admirable siblings who are in one way or another supporting them. Will adds, but he doesn't kill Philip. So the brother's keeper line is particularly a reference to Cain and Abel, right? And so if we're just taking it as one of them is the other's brother and is keeping the other in the sense of supporting them, then it does apply. And if we're taking it to be a specific reference to the Cain and Abel myth, which it is at some level because that line comes from the Bible, but we don't have a story between these sibling pairs like the story of Cain and Abel, where one kills the other and then, when asked about it, says, well, am I my brother's keeper? So let me see if Will says any more about this. Just that at one point Reardon experienced an urge to kill Lillian, and did not. So, but I don't know if that makes him Lillian's keeper. If he's her keeper, it's for other reasons than those. Okay, do we have more thoughts in the room on this, or on other topics, or online? This is pretty much an open discussion. So, I have a few things I'll bring up at some point, but go ahead.
This might be too abstract for a bit later in the book, but do you think Dagny already knows what Reardon has to learn at this point in order to go on strike?
I think we know that she doesn't, as of our last seeing of Dagny, right? We don't see her in this chapter, so who knows what she's learned in the interim. But what Axton tells Dagny she needs to learn is that that people don't, or many people don't value their lives, and that's one of several things that Reardon learns in this chapter.
So he learns the lesson. So the sanction of the victim point is connected intimately somehow to the value of human life point, in terms, or to the motivations of those who seek to trade by pretend value rather than by actual value.
Well, so I would say there are two sequences of things Reardon learns in this chapter. One is that people like his family don't value their lives. They don't want to live. If they did, they would have known how to value him, and in general, how to value the things on which their lives depend. He's just the salient instance of it, right? So that's one point. That's the point that Axton's identified as the last one Dagny needs to learn. Seemingly, it's not the last one Reardon needs to learn, because he doesn't just go quit right when he learns that. Then he goes to have this meeting with the looters, and we have this scene of the three tumblers clicking into place. And what he's recognizing in that scene is what? Well, there are a few elements to it. The main thing he's recognizing is his own role in making possible the looters' mode of existence. And indeed, not just their existential mode of existence, but their mode of consciousness. Say again?
Yeah, so he makes it possible for them to fake it.
Yeah, and for them to not just fake that they want to live, but so what's puzzling about the looters is they can propose and pursue plans that are obviously unworkable, and say, well, it will work somehow, when there's no how that it can work. And how is it that they're able to do that? And Reardon's, in effect, created a world where they are able to do that by always taking it upon himself to do the thing. There was an old line that used to be said in objectivist circles back in the 60s that I've been told, maybe by Brandon or by Blumenthal or others, but somehow always means somebody. And the idea is, where there's some vague somehow this will be made to work somehow, well, there's somebody who are expecting to make it work for us at his expense. And Reardon's been playing that role. And what he comes to realize is that. And that in a pretty deep way. The looters are in this meeting, right? And the way Reardon thinks of them in this meeting is having wishes for effects that they want to occur, without any thought for how they could occur, or even whether they're possible. So their wishes are just, they wish, and they expect what they wish to come into existence, and they can set up a state of affairs where it will come into existence. They don't have to give any thought to whether or how it's possible to causes. They don't have to think causally. As though their wishes could be omnipotent, and their wishes didn't have to be set by reality or constrained by reality, or more importantly, built on a recognition of how things can be. And Reardon's what Reardon is realizing is that that whole acausal way of thinking and desiring is made possible by him. And that's what makes him quit. And she's realizing that they have this kind of acausal way of thinking, and then that he's responsible for enabling it by diverting the destruction that comes from this from the people who are trying to live this way. I'll come to just 1 second. So that's Reardon's final realization. It comes after, for him, the not wanting to live point. Now, interestingly, we see Dagny starting to get this realization, the one that's second for Reardon, the ultimate one for Reardon. We see Dagny starting to get that realization in chapter 5. So it's seeming like the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place in a different order for the two of them.
Yeah, very early on in the novel, Jim says it all depends on knowing who makes it all possible.
Yeah, that's a point that I think we even paused over at the moment, right? And it's a really beautiful point because Jim is, at least overtly means, and maybe he himself thinks he means, you got to know the right planners and the right people to pull their strings and manipulate and so forth. At least the context makes it seem like he's got the connections in Washington. But what's beautiful about that passage to me is the next line is something like Dagny Taggart was 9 years old when she decided she would run the railroad someday. And then we get Dagny's whole history with the railroad and Jim's history with her. And so whether Jim intended it to mean you got to know that Dagny's the one who makes it possible or not, I think the author, by setting up that contrast, is leading us to think who really makes Jim's way of life possible, and that it's Dagny and his connection to Dagny. What we see Dagny realizing in chapter 5 is that Jim has this kind of mystical view of the world. And, I mean, if people are familiar with the problem of evil in philosophy or theology, I guess, this is the classic argument against the existence of God, right? If God existed, there'd be no bad in the world, but there is bad in the world, therefore God can't exist. Or if there was an omnipotent being, he wouldn't allow this. And then there are arguments that are made to defend the existence of God by saying, well, here's why God might allow some bad. You see this kind of dynamic happening in chapter 5 between Jim and Dagny, with him treating her like a god. So he's saying, you're the doer. You're the Nat Taggart. You're the one who has the ability to do things and make whatever you want. It's your world. You're the one with the ability to make it. So how come I can't have my desires? It's your fault. Why do you make the world such that I'm unhappy? I want to be president of a railroad, and it makes me feel important. And how come you're not? It's your fault. You, God, Dagny, who's able to make somehow anything happen, aren't making the world such that I'm comfortable. And but there's this kind of sense. I mean, I'm making his petulance funnier than it's meant to be, but there's this sense of there's no issue of how Dagny does it, of what the causes are, or that there are causes, of what cost it is to her. It's just so long as she's there, she can make whatever happens happen, and then he just has to kind of do whatever he needs to do to her to get her to grant his wishes, like she's a genie in a bottle or a god that she can trick or propitiate or whatever.
It's what you do.
Yeah, it's what
You'll do it because it's what you do. I mean, I do what I do because I am the way I am, and you're just lucky or whatever to be what you are. You keep hearing that in that side. You do this because it's what you do, not because you have any real virtues, not because you love it, not because there's anything good about you. It's just what you do.
And there's a difference because the people who think about a god at least think the god's good, and they try to, they speak well of him. We don't see Jim doing that with Dagny. So he's trying to evade the value of it. He's also trying to not think about what it is about her that enables her to do these things. And like Hank is realizing of the looters in the following chapter, chapter 6, we see we see what he's asking for is more and more obviously impossible, and he's rebelling against that. So he wants Dagny to make the railroad unification plan work. When it can't work, he wants him to protect her from Cuffy Meggs without acknowledging the existence of a Cuffy Meggs. That brings me to, I think not right now, but at some point I want to say a little bit more about Cuffy and Jim. Okay, so let's see what we're getting online. Will is saying, Earl, who's one of the people who, like Will, joins us often in New York, remarks that the idea, you'll think of something implies we certainly can't think of something. And I think that's true, and a good point on the looters, about the looters. Mohammed asks, what realizations does Dagny still have to cross off her checklist? Well, we'll have to see, but we could say this much, that Hugh Axton thinks the last premise she has us to check is that all of the people in the outside world want to live. And Reardon has come to think that's not true.
I put to the group.
Go ahead, Deb.
When, and I'm certainly have my own idea about it, but I'm not sure that everybody agrees with me on it, so I'll put it out there. When you suggest that the people outside of that circle of the main characters of this novel do or don't want to live, or that they don't value their lives, in what sense is it that they don't want to live? And I'll just put it out there as a question, so people might
are you
immediately
claiming that
say.
someone is? Are you claiming that the author is claiming that nobody wants to live?
No, I'm just. She's obviously identified it and made it somewhat clear anyway.
Certainly,
But it was a
some
whole
people-
essay topic you could make for Atlas Shrugged. It's in what sense do the looters or the moochers not want to live?
Well,
I mean,
they
they
certainly
certainly
don't
can
want to
be
live.
terrified by some of the things that they'll put up against themselves and one another. They can be scared enough, but what is it about them that that makes it that they're characterized by not really wanting to
They
live?
certainly
Because
don't want
she's
to
certainly-
live.
she's
They
a-
certainly don't want to live as rational beings. They don't want to. They don't want to. Certainly, they'd love to be able to survive by somehow, right? but they don't value the things which make it possible for them to live.
Yeah, a formulation I really find helpful is the idea they don't want to live, but they want to get away with living, in the sense that they want someone to enable them to go through the motions, without having to enact the cause. But that's a fundamentally different kind of desire, and sort of more subtractive than additive in a certain way. That there's not like this positive vision of a kind of life they want to have, because that involves thinking about effects and causes and thinking about your role as an agent, creating a certain kind of life. They want to feel comfortable in a certain way that they kind of can vaguely see that, Dagny and Reardon have something going for them that is threatening in a certain way, right? Because it sort of reminds them of, okay, maybe there's some other way of living that isn't what I'm doing, and that's kind of scary. But whatever it is they want, it doesn't involve an actual vision of what it would mean to live as a human.
Also, they have a sense of relief when the possibilities in life close down on them. So, for instance, when Jim, he has a letter of resignation in his hand, he's thinking, oh, I won't be the CEO, but nobody else will be, and I won't have to worry about this.
And he wants to try to avoid making decisions. A few lines, we see that in the with 10289 in the meeting where they're talking about passing it. A few points that are coming over on the chat that fit with this. Will says they want to live without doing any of the work of living, which connects to maybe this idea of wanting to get away with living that Gina said. Muhammad points out that Rand drew a connection, I have an essay about this, between living and valuing, and if you think that maybe valuing is part of the work of living, and that might be what Gina's talking about, maybe that's the work they want to not do, and in that sense just get away with living. There's a lot more to say about this. I'll myself only say a little bit tonight, though I'm happy to hear more thoughts on it, but because I think we're going to get a lot more about this, Galt's perspective on it in his speech. But I don't know that we want to put all of the characters in the same boat here. So, who is it that doesn't want to live, according to Axton? Is it everyone in the outside society, or just people, or most people, or just Jim and people like him? And if the answer is meant to apply to more than the very worst of the people, does it apply to all of the people in the same way? Because I think what drives someone like Jim is different from what drives, say, the various employees of Taggart Transcontinental that we met in Chapter 5, who didn't have anything, didn't want to do anything about the all the catastrophes that were happening in that chapter. So it's not clear that we should take. It might be only the very worst of the people don't want to live. Or it might be that a lot of the people don't want to live, but there are different ways of not wanting to live. And some of them are just more passive, kind of not really loving intensely your life and doing the work that it requires. And this is maybe what we're getting with the kind of things that that Gina and Will and Mohammed are talking about. But there might also be another kind of motivation that's not just a lack, but a positive presence of something that runs in a counter direction to life. Because there's a difference between the thug who's bashing Reardon's skull in and the people on the train, say, who thought, well, I can find a way to get around in any society or something like that.
Could you say in a certain sense that his pretending to, or his getting away with living got much farther out of hand, in the sense that he went to far greater lengths, the thug who's beating Reardon over the head, or Jim, or one of the, or Ferris, to the extent that they have now gone to the great lengths of committing evil acts and murdering, and so that, to that extent, that the motivation in a way starts similarly, that there's this need to pretend and this need to bolster a kind of fake view of oneself and of one's life, and then you go to greater and greater lengths to do that, in the way that evasion is kind of the positive version of drift, or rationalization is the active version of meh.
Yeah, do you want to try to put that in less techie terms, like people might not know this?
Sure. Yes. So someone who is a criminal who is so far gone in terms of needing. Can we use Trump? Can we get there's just
You
no
could
better
talk about anyone who you want, I suppose. I don't know if everyone's going to agree with you, but
yeah, so someone who needs. So just thinking about it in terms of how much are you trying to rationalize in order to still preserve some appearance that you're a good person who deserves to live and is living and is somehow a hero and not a villain. If you've committed an act of plunder, you're going to need to do a lot more work to kind of convince yourself to hide from certain facts that make you just clearly a bad guy, and to forget or somehow talk yourself into seeing noble motivations in a lot more of your bad deeds than
make up good excuses.
Yeah, and so it's you have to work harder in a certain twisted sense to continue to get away with it in your own mind, versus if you're the wet nurse, or if you're, or not, but yeah, if you're one of the kind of mid-level people, or even to some extent, I think we see this with Stadler, we kind of see a progression downward with him, where at first he's kind of just this disillusioned scientist who has this premise that you gotta work with people are irrational. So, I know people like that who, will take federal funds even though they think that the motivation of the grant givers isn't so great, and they can maybe see that as being, they're not completely sure that it's completely ethical, but it's a reasonable compromise. But then you could kind of imagine if they have to justify worse, and if they realize, oh wow, so now this thing I wrote in order to keep doing my science has led to heroic people losing their jobs and and going to jail. okay, wait, how do I still live with myself? How do I explain this to myself as being, and then he just starts telling himself bigger and bigger lies, and thereby also committing worse and worse evils, and then he turns into
There's an issue of how people get worse. And is there a kind of path from trivial immorality, or trivial sounds too small, but from little immoralities of the sort that an essentially good person could do at a character, to what's characteristic of a really evil person? Because it's not like, if you're a decent or even pretty crappy person, but not horrible, it's not as though you might go on a killing spree tomorrow. And it wouldn't even occur to you, have no motivation to do that. But is there what are the steps by which somebody could get into a situation where they do start to get motivated in that way? And maybe by doing the kinds of bad things that are within the motivational framework of a regular person, or even a good person, you can become a less good person and devolve into that state. That's something to think about. In the case of Stadler, I don't think his early position, when we meet him in the novel, is the level of somebody who is applying for a federal grant like everyone in science in the world. I mean, here we are in a Smithsonian, that anyone in science has to do, and has some misgivings about the justice of the way science is done in the country. Right? So that's not the state of Stadler even 10 years into the past in the novel, or 12 years into the past in the novel, right? Stadler is someone who campaigned for the nationalization of science to begin with. So he's someone who, he's, in effect, the person who was setting up the NSF, right, national, or whatever, with NIH and all, but there were the different groups. Well, he's the person who wanted it to be the case that all the funding for science went through the government in the first place for some reason, and knew better, or should have known better than to want that.
So
and
had to be lying to himself quite a bit. But
and then he's gone down from there to,
yeah.
by the time we meet him in the first.
I think what's interesting about him is he's someone who we can probably surmise at some point really did want to live.
Mm-hmm.
And he had partially good motivations and then partially evasive ones for the things he was doing early on. And then the evasive ones started to grow and to metastasize the way they do because he has to continue the lie. And then it kind of gets bigger and bigger and harder to contain, to the point where he's now doing a lot more pretending than he is actually living, in a sense. So maybe pretending to live versus actually living, to me that makes even more, like that clarifies it even more than the getting away with.
So, two thoughts here. I want to come back to this pretending to live as the second of them. But the first is, I mean, if Tony the wet nurse is the character we see growing and improving, right? Stadler is our example of a character devolving that we get. But we should keep in mind Galt damned him more than 10 or 12 years before the start of the novel. And he said to Axton, right after that, "Damn you idealists," and Axton saw that it was a man pronouncing his death sentence. So from the perspective of the heroes of the book, he's a guy whose main decisions in the wrong direction happened a long time ago, and who they already regarded as irredeemable. Now, maybe they were wrong to regard him, or at least they already regarded him as really significantly bad. Maybe if he had a really good therapist, I don't know. But he wouldn't have been motivated to go to the really good therapist. So, well, but that sounds like Daphne's premise.
I'm not saying they currently want to live. I'm saying I could help them to get there.
Well, let's come back to that in a moment. But yeah, the therapist who could help you even if you don't want it.
That's right.
Which is
The scientist has to want to change.
Which is quite a shingle to hang out. But So from Galt and Axton's perspective, Stadler's taken a really significant step a long time ago that, in their view, makes him irredeemable. Which irredeemable, I don't think means that he's not still making choices that he could make the better or the worse choice, but a big enough bad choice that the kind of verdict on this guy was that he massively betrayed the good in his life. So he can't do something now whereby we'll say, well, that was just one little fact about him, right? So I take it that's what it means to say. And we see him making further bad choices to betray things that he knows to be good over the course of the novel. And now we've seen him, let's recall what they are, right? He knew Reardon Metal was good. He knew that Reardon Metal was being damned by the State Science Institute for dishonest reasons to cover up their own ineptitude. And yet he let them go ahead doing that. He wouldn't stop them from doing it, right? Because he thought otherwise he'd be sacrificing his institute. Then he believed that things have to be sacrificed, and was saying that knowing that this metal is good, and knowing that what was being said about it was unscientific and disgusting by an organ of science that he founded that spoke under his name with the slogan "To the Inviolate Mind," right, on its slogan. So he had every reason to know this was a real serious betrayal of concrete values of great intellectual achievements and of the abstract principle he stood for, and yet he did nothing. He tried to destroy your railroad and my metal, as Reardon put it. Then the organization comes out with this "what makes you think" screed, and he, kind of bitches about it privately to its author, but doesn't do anything about it when he knows he could, and he doesn't.
So he's really bad.
And then he's at he's being trotted out to make the public swallow this death machine, and he knows that that's what it is. And he doesn't say when he could, and when the young press person who reminds him of Galt says, you can tell them, they'll believe you, if you say what this machine is. He says, get this tramp with a punk with treasonable motives away from me, and so forth. And then he reads this speech prepared to him by Stadler, by Ferris, about how he's happy to give this great tool of science. And then he's himself in the next chapter repeating the BS from what makes you think. So this is a guy who's really, on a express to hell. Now, the other point you were making, Gina, though, was about, so we've had a couple of different descriptions of the alternative to living, to what Galt means by wanting to live. Wanting to get away with living, wanting to live without doing the work of living. Now you're saying wanting to pretend to live. But this idea, too, of pretending to live brings into it the idea that what's meant by living is this complicated thing that has all these... It's not just that you're alive versus dead. It's that you're engaged in this kind of complex psychological process, this process of pursuing values and setting values, and you care about things and so forth. And they're only pretending to do that. And I think there's something right about that. But I think we do need to connect this to, does it matter to them that they're alive versus dead? And I think this brings us back to the Tony scene, right? Because Tony is dying. Literally dying. He's dying, and he's gonna, let's see if we can find the scene. Well, here. Would someone want to find the scene for me? If you got it on your phone? He says about how he feels about dying, right? And it's interesting because he didn't, it matters to him.
Yes.
That's one of the points. But another point about it is he's just realizing how much life means to him, which he hadn't known before, right?
That it was important. Because it was important to him.
Yeah.
He says, I'd like to live, Mr. Reardon. God, how I'd like to. His voice was passionately quiet. Not because I'm dying, but because I've just discovered it tonight, what it means really to be alive. And it's funny. Do you know when I discovered it? In the office, when I stuck my neck out, when I told the bastards to go to hell.
Right. So read the beginning of that again. I want to live, yeah.
I'd like to live, Mr. Reardon, God, how I'd like to. Not because I'm dying, but because I've just discovered tonight what it really means. What it means really to be alive.
Yeah, and that's what I think is significant. So it's here he's dying, right? And the fact that he's dying is more upsetting to him than it would otherwise be, because now he knows what it is to live, right? Before, I mean, he didn't want to die, but there wasn't something that was a contrast to death that was really deeply important to him in the way there is now. And so here we have whatever this thing that he just started doing or fully doing tonight, right, connected to why you want to stay alive versus die. And that's, I think we need to fill that in more. Evan?
Yeah, and I think that relating to that, in contrast to his perspective on life that he had at that point, what Reardon is discovering about his family is that, if they really were concerned about what was required in order to keep them alive, they would not have acted the way they did. And these very stark contrast in the way that they just don't know how to value him, even though Reardon is the source of what's keeping them in existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what does it mean to say you want something when, in fact, you're not motivated to do any of the things needed to achieve it, or to preserve any of the things on which it depends? It sounds like you're just saying you want it, or you don't want to admit to yourself that you don't want it, or maybe you're afraid of losing it without really wanting it, or you're afraid. I mean, think about if you're in a relationship with someone and you say you love them and you don't want to lose them or whatever, but then everything you do says the opposite. Is it what you want to get away with being in a relationship with them? Well, maybe in a way. Is what you want to pretend to be in a relationship with them? Well, maybe in a way. But it's also true that you don't want, you as judged by your actions and judged by all the values that have to be causally connected to the value of keeping them, you don't really want them. You don't value that relationship. You're not acting to gain or keep or preserve that relationship.
So I guess what you're describing now, because before you were making the contrast between there's kind of a passive wanting to get away with it, wanting to pretend, and then there's this more active, like, kind of wanting to die, or at least actively not wanting to live. But it's what you're describing now sounds like the more passive, like, default state, because people don't automatically want to live.
Right.
They have to have some conception of what it is that living that makes
have
it
to
worth
value.
living, right? Yeah, and
They
they have
have
to
to
have
hold
something to want to
values.
live for and about. Yeah, and so that seems like the passive default state is like, I don't know.
But isn't that the role that religion traditionally played?
Well, so let me say something before, because religion is another big topic, and let's make another comment before we bring that in. So I think even the passive default state has to be, if there's a passive default not wanting to live, and there's some active being anti-life mode, even the passive default state has to be understood as literally not valuing your life or not wanting to live, as opposed to there's this grandiose, metaphorical, or elaborated sense of life, and they don't want that, but they still want to live as opposed to die. Even that, I think, Reardon is thinking, and Dachney is meant to learn. Even this less deeply vicious thing, if maybe there is such a thing, is not actually wanting to live, in a way that the Tony only fully realized what it was to live and only fully started wanting it that night, even though he was kind of inching towards it prior to that, and he wasn't a hater of life prior to that. But that's what makes it meaningful to you to stay alive versus to die is something that takes some kind of work and isn't automatically there, and that people don't automatically have that even. And then we can go from that baseline to think about what about people like Jim Taggart, who seems to take a glee or Lillian, who seems to take a glee in the destruction of the things on which life depends, including their own, as opposed to just being indifferent towards it. And for Reardon's family, I think both Philip and his mother do take a kind of delight in destruction, though not at the level of a Lillian or a Jim. Now, as to religion, what were you saying about it, Troll?
when I was a kid, there was a TV show called Life is Worth Living. It was Fulton J. Sheen. Okay, it was that, and this guy actually got on TV to convince people that your life is worth living, as it were. And I was kind of shocked, and I'm 16 years old. You know, I'm reading this and I'm watching this, and I'm kind of shocked that this could possibly be, but as I have progressed over the decades, I can see that this guy had it right all along, in that people don't have this sense that life is worth living for the very reason that Gina pointed out. You don't do the things that support your sense of yourself so that your life is in fact worth living and being productive and so on.
So what were this bishop's what was his advice? What were his reasons for thinking life worth living?
Because I don't know. I just flipped the channel. But
You didn't need the advice.
I didn't
Your
need the
life
advice.
Your
I had
life
a
was
whole
plenty
row
worth
waiting
living
for
as
me.
So what you're seeing that he was right about was that this is a question people have. Is life worth living? What makes it worth living? Not the particular advice some particular pieces of advice he gave. We didn't say he might not have given good pieces of advice. We just don't know what they were. So I don't think that it's true that there is a need, I think, for some kind of inspiration and for some kind of sense of what it's worth living for, if it's worth living. And I do think that there are any number of people who have tried to supply this want, right? Some of them religious leaders, some of them non-religious leaders from other places, and that some of what they've supplied it with was good, and some was bad, and some was a mix. I think throughout history we have to think that this is true. I don't know that I would say that that's the role religion in general has played. Like if you think about what is central to most religions and most religious leaders' teaching, that we could say most religious leaders are about giving you something it's worth living for. Maybe that's, I mean, it would be interesting to see from their own perspective what they're trying to do. And I think some might tell you that that's what they're trying to do, and others are not. I mean, there are these books like The Purpose-Driven Life that came out a few years ago that was very popular, which has the same kind of feel to it, right? And I haven't read it, so I don't know. I've read the back cover and the front, so I know what its pitch is, but not. And I know a lot of my religious students have talked about, wanting to live to glory God or glorify God. And I think there are other cases when people talking about meaning in life, if you think about the kind of stuff Jordan Peterson has been talking about and creating an audience, a lot of it is finding meaning in life and the need to find meaning in life, and he's religious and talks about the connection of religion to that sometimes. So I do think religion makes some attempt at doing this, at least some religious leaders do. And that is a topic we'll get to hear Galt on a bit next week or 2 weeks.
Down morally because you are supposed to be selfish, so you can't live for yourself. You're beaten down mentally because you get the idea that the world and life are not understandable. I can imagine that people at any age might decide that life's not much worth living, and then once you've gotten them into that state, you can say, well, let's look at this God, or look at this these religious ideas, and this is what you're fundamentally craving here now that the other stuff has been sabotaged.
Yeah, I mean,
Which might be what Ayn Rand was talking about, having your wings mangled, and then
yeah. Although that way of putting it, you have your wings mangled, and then you're given something else instead of wings, right? Makes it suggests that the wings just come. Right, and so nothing has to happen for the wings to be there and for you to be fine, but then they could get mangled. But if it's the case that the wings don't automatically come, or it's analogous to wings here, or aren't automatically things that you know how to use, so that the parent bird has to teach the fledgling to fly, and in the case of a human being, it's more complicated. The human beings need to be taught to think and taught to value and taught to do whatever it is we need to do such that our lives are meaningful to us. Then it's not just an issue of someone mangling the thing and then selling you some substitute. It's rather there are a whole bunch of different alternatives, right? One is just you're never taught how to develop it, and then you have a certain need and somebody offers you a substitute for it. Or what you might think is happening, since it's the teachers who are supposed to be doing this, is the people who are supposed to help you develop this ability are not only not helping, but are being positively destructive to it. So it would be bad enough if they just didn't give you the help that was needed, but it's not, but they're actually doing harm in addition to that. But the solution isn't just to get rid of them. You need someone playing this role. You need someone teaching you how to live, teaching you how to think. So that what Reardon thinks about the mother isn't just she should have yanked this kid out of college, but she should have gone trying to find the people like you, Axton, right? Not, she needed someone. It's not like no one would have been good, but who he got was worse than nothing. And we might think that about, I think that would be Galt's view about religious leaders in general. Right now, that said, there might be, and other teachers in general in the world of the novel, and I think it was Rand's view to a large extent about the teachers in the actual world. But that doesn't mean there aren't exceptions, and that doesn't mean that there aren't in Galt's or in Rand's view partial exceptions even within an individual person. So there might be, for example, a minister who mixes in some really good advice with some really soul-destroying things. And there were people who Rand thought that about. In fact, even the Reverend Ike, she thought, had some good advice, for example, who, in addition to being religious, was also sort of a charlatan in some respects, but also gave some really good self-help advice. So I don't know if people know about the Reverend Ike.
What was the one quote of his that she liked?
The best way to help the poor is to not be one of them?
Yes. That's
Right.
it.
Yeah, and he was a sort of, self-help, self-actualization kind of a preacher, African-American preacher, and but he also, also part of the way not to be one of them is to send money to his congregation. So,
before
but-
going, I
which
mean,
was not
I
just
know
to-
there's more stuff
Yeah.
to cover, but just to as much in a little bit more of the social context. Ayn Rand admired America, but when she came here, she found Americans, a lot of them that she met, to be wanting, that they were not very deep. They were rather shallow thinking people. That she was surprised at that level of shallowness that she just saw in people day to day, even if she met people like Cecil B. DeMille or whatever that were obviously influential and had a lot of influence. So I wonder if that goes into this idea of wanting to live, knowing how to value it. Was there something in the way Americans were beginning to live already at that point when she arrived here that she's trying to address in this notion of what does it mean to want to be alive?
I think her views on Americans in general and people in general were complex, and I think they changed. I don't think they changed. They did a 180, but there was one period very early on where I think she had a particularly bleak view of most people. If you read her notes for the Little Street and so forth, I think that was a brief, very bleak period. But putting that aside, I think her views, there were different elements she saw in people in general across the world and in Americans in particular, and which she saw as more prominent, changed over the course of her life, and I don't think in a unidirectional manner. And whether that was that people were changing, or she thought that they were, or that just what she was more attuned to or noticing about people were changing, or most likely both, because the population changes and develops not always in a univocal direction, and what you're aware of for anyone changes. But she did think that Americans were not especially intellectual in the sense of they were not interested, there wasn't a kind of high culture or an interest in philosophy and
That's what I was driving at.
in a way that
Have
there
the
was
appreciation
Yeah.
for the intellectual
in a way that there
basis
was
of their life.
in a way that there were such things more in Europe, but the products of this kind of intellectual culture was such a sewer, she thought, that it was sort of healthy that America was, rejecting what was on the offer as high culture, but it wasn't developing its own either. And she thought that was a problem. And she was trying to encourage it too. And she was, in effect, a contributor to a high culture in America, or an intellectual culture in America, such as there's come to be, or such as there may come to be. So the first of their return is, Axton says, of the great advocates of reason. And she says herself, of romantic artists, she hopes to be the first of their return, and I think also the advocates of reason. So that's one element. Let me say one or two more things, please. And then we have some more people wanting to speak. So that's one element of it. Another is she thought, at least at certain points, it was particularly salient to her that there was a kind of very valuable common sense in the average American, and that there was something which she called the American sense of life, which a sense of life is a kind of an attitude or approach to living that's not kind of intellectualized. It's not a philosophy of life, but it's kind of emotional equivalent of that, a kind of attitude towards the world. And she thought there was a distinctively American sense of life that sets Americans apart from Europe. It's not that every single American has it, and every single European doesn't, but it's a kind of common denominator in the feel or the attitude of Americans. And she thought that was very positive. And I think you can see Cheryl Taggart as a real, in Atlas, the expression of the American sense of life. She's a character who is how Rand thinks Americans are. And at various times in her life, this fact about America became particularly salient to her, and there were questions about how much good can be accomplished on sense of life alone without having the explicit philosophy, and how much couldn't, and how would it lead people, and so forth. And for those of us who think she was right about these things, there's the question of what trajectory has the American sense of life taken since? Was she right about what it was and what its role was back in the 70s when she was writing about this? Is it the same now? How do we see it at work in our current national conversations and politics? There were some people on one of the email lists, for example, talking about whether the Trump election is an example of the American sense of life asserting itself, because you could see either Trump or maybe the Trump voters as an expression of it. On the other hand, you might think it's exactly the opposite, that Trump and Trump voters are much more like Rand thought Europeans were and not like Americans were. Or you might think it's a more complicated interplay between the two. Rand, writing about sense of life back in the early 60s, wrote that a sense of life is not, because it's not intellectual and articulate, it can often find expression in its opposite. So it might be that the case, for example, that some political movement, whether that's John F. Kennedy or Trump or Goldwater or whoever, Johnson, is either for, at a deepest level, consonant or non-consonant with the American sense of life, and yet some significant number of people who have the opposite sense of life see something in it that they endorse, right? Though that's not really what the essence of the phenomenon is. So these are complicated kinds of things to work out.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
actually,
Fanny.
you covered my thought about
Oh,
the
I
sense
didn't
of
get to-
life. That's what I was going to first.
So what were you going to say about it?
The positive sense of life she saw in Americans,
Mhm.
and that without the philosophy to reinforce, and it will not be sufficient to really save the culture.
Yeah, that issue of sufficiency to save one's own life and the culture is, it couldn't save Cheryl, for example, alone. Does anyone want to say anything about what the American sense of life is? We said that there's this idea, and several of us have now alluded to it, but what is the content of it? What's distinctive about the way Americans face the world? At least as Rand saw it, talking about Americans in the 50s and 60s. Dan online mentions, I'd mentioned Cheryl as a character who you might think of as embodying it. Dan mentions Eddie also, if it's possible. Evan?
Yeah, so just leading off the clue that you gave, that Cheryl is a lot of embodying this idea of an American sense of life that's distinct from what the sense of life you might find in Europe might be. Is that Cheryl, and I think this applies to the sense of life in general, has an admiration for ability, a drive to succeed on her own terms through her own effort, and to more seek out life not for pity or for any kind of trying to get someone else to live for her, but she wants to live for herself, and also seeing things for herself, using her own eyes and judgment. To a large extent, I think all of those things are captured in the distinctly American sense of life.
Yes, there's a pro-value, pro-achievement, and individualistic character to it. Daron, writing online, adds, and this is a very near paraphrase, if not a direct quote from Ayn Rand, the Americans' reaction to overbearing authority is defiance rather than subordination. I think that's the point in particular that might lead you to think in either direction about Trump, right? So if you think that there's an elite liberal establishment that's exercising an overbearing authority on us and constraining the kinds of thoughts we can express and things we can do, and is in general out to put us down, you could see a wanting to defy that, and you could see wanting to support someone who's like a champion of defying that. And I think that's how you would be thinking about it if you think of either Trump as expressing the American sense of life, or if you think of whether or not Trump himself does the phenomenon of people being interested in him, supporting it. On the other hand, if you think of Trump as somebody who screams that what he wants to do is exercise overbearing authority, then supporting him is submitting to and championing overbearing authority rather than defying it. But that's just the sort of thing that if you're reacting emotionally to an overbearing authority is not the kind of determination that everybody's going to make in the same way. That is, which authority do you notice as being overbearing, and do you react against? And you can often react against it in a way that's not consonant with it, and so therefore not support Trump when you should, if that's the right way to challenge overbearing authority, or support him when you shouldn't, if, again, what your goal is to defy overbearing authority. And these are, assessing current politicians is somewhat beyond our scope, but that's, I think, what the psychological and philosophical issue here would be, and it's why people see this election in two different lights. I don't think it's a secret in which light I see it, so from my previous comments. Dan mentions a can-do sense of life in America, and I think we see that in Cheryl also. And again, you can see that going either way in how you support this election. Do you think of Trump as somebody who exudes a can-do attitude? We can make America great again. Incidentally, you might think of Obama as exuding that too. Yes, we can, right? And you might therefore think of Obama's election as showing the resurgence of the American sense of life, or you might think of it as the opposite of that, a collectivist who was giving people meaningless drivel to rally around. I'll say that's how I think of both of these elections, although the second way, though the more recent one, worse than the former. I think it's a snowballing in this direction. But if you think of Trump, or else you might think of Trump as a can't do, blame it all on other people, those immigrants and Mexicans and Chinese people, and not going against taking responsibility. And again, it takes a lot of intellectual development to identify what is actually going on in these cases. And so if you're reacting just on sense of life grounds, just on you respond to what feels can do to you, or you respond negatively to what feels like authority to you, it's going to not be reliable that you're going to actually be pursuing the can do and defying the authority. It's a lot of it's going to be just how it seems to you now, and you're not going to be able to tell. And likewise in the novel, if you're Eddie or Jim, you know, the hero-worshipping sense of life, sorry, not Eddie or Cheryl, the hero-worshipping sense of life of a Cheryl that's attracted to somebody who would stand up against the whole world to achieve something great might lead you to marry Jim. And not realize any better. And at some point, if you do make that kind of a mistake, whether in politics or in your personal life or in anything else, the evidence of it will start mounting. And there'll be a point where you'll have to make a choice of how important is it to you to know what's real and have what's real. Like Cheryl makes in that scene that Robert pointed out when he was with us in New York, is so heroic, where she decides, you know, what then is maintaining her loyalty to this value? Is it deluding herself? And so, you know, no, it can't be. And now we see her on an intellectual quest to find out what Jim really is. And even before the end of this quest, she realizes what she needs is more than just to understand Jim in particular, but to understand philosophically what makes things right and wrong, what's going on, how do I judge and evaluate these things. There's something wrong with the moral code in society. Something's backwards about the way we view things. It's like the traffic signals are in reverse. We have, for the traffic of your body, for cars, we have a green light telling you when it's safe and good to go, and a red light telling you to stop. But something about the way we've been taught to view morality and taught to view our lives is backwards like this. Where are the people who could say and explain it? Where are the men who could explain this, who can tell us, who could solve this problem? And for the answer, stay tuned for Chapter 7 of Atlas Shrugged, where we get John Galt speaking. And we get, I think, the question Cheryl was looking for the answer to. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to more discussion in future episodes of the Atlas Project.